Let's talk a little bit about Parry, because we're preparing his symphony for the concerts coming up. You, I believe, become somewhat of an advocate, maybe, for his work in recent times. Tell me a little bit about your journey there.
Well, I've always had a huge interest in Parry's music from a choral basis, because I've sung a lot of the choral music, and I've always thought it was tremendous stuff. He was a real master of craftsmanship and also inspiration. I mean, there's just a beautiful melodic freshness that he brings. But my interest in Parry as a symphonist developed quite early on, because I bought an early Naxos recording of his Second Symphony, the Cambridge Symphony. The reason I'm interested now is because I finally came back to that nascent interest and listened really seriously and in depth and thoughtfully to a lot of the symphonies, the shorter orchestral works, the overtures, and I thought, this really is music that speaks very directly and deserves to be heard more widely. I was just astonished that it's recorded not very frequently and is not performed at the concert platform. I was also interested that Parry lived locally in Rustington for almost 40 years. And
so Rustington is on the south coast, near to Worthing, and was a place where he spent a lot of time.
Absolutely. So I thought, look, let's draw these strands together. Maybe just try putting a Parry symphony on a concert programme. And I was grateful that this idea was received so warmly and that the orchestra's taken to playing the music so warmly. I have gone for what was perhaps his most popular symphony for about 20 years after it was written. In fact, it was the most often performed symphony by an English composer.
Why was that?
I think because it was written for a modest-sized orchestra, not terribly difficult to play. The parts were published at the same time as the score, which made a huge difference. It wasn't the case for all of Parry's symphonies. And it was therefore taken up by a lot of amateur orchestral societies, as well as being played professionally. And it had had a very good critical reception. At its premiere, people felt, look, here's the first symphony that really speaks to a notion of what we think of as English music. It was a very accessible style. There was a very distinct national characteristic in terms of the quality of the thematic material. And it had a sort of freshness that people seemed to prize, a very accessible quality. And I think those are the main reasons. Parry, I think, was a little bit disturbed by the fact that this particular symphony was gaining more attention than works he thought were more important. It had its premiere only a matter of weeks after the third, and was not anywhere near as well received, which I think really rather galled him. And he made extensive revisions of the third symphony as well, but particularly the fourth and fifth he thought should have been more widely known.
You mentioned that a lot of his work isn't perhaps as widely known as maybe you think it should be. What is it that you think makes his work really unique?
I think he's really writing in a way that acknowledges the influences of Austro-German music that his forebears in writing in Britain felt very, very strongly. People like Sterndale Bennett, Cipriani Potter, and so they're very, very influenced by what was going on the continent. And I think Parry took all of that, plus an interest in more radical composers, such as Wagner at the time. He was a passionate Wagnerian in his younger days. And he found a sort of way of synthesizing that with his own craftsmanship and producing something that, whilst it nodded to those traditions, was actually quite individual. And you can really recognize a strong compositional identity in Parry's music. The more I listen to the symphonic output, the more I'm just recognizing kernels of motives and styles, and so which could be nobody but Parry. And I think the fact that he paved the way for people like Elgar and Vaughan Williams, and of course a lot of people of that generation were students of his at the Royal College of Music, I think also very significant. So I think his music is fascinating in its own right and certainly worth hearing, but that he's such an important figure in the development of a new British musical tradition that I feel for him to be so unjustly neglected is really unfortunate. And I'm not going to do something about that single-handedly. There are many colleagues of mine in the past, both on the performing platform and musicologists, have started to correct this, as it were, since the 80s. But why are we not seeing any of the major orchestras in London occasionally performing a Parry symphony? It's astonishing.
I think it's really interesting you bring up identity, I wonder how it feels now bringing music like this back at a time when, if you just look at the world at large and the narratives we see in the news about different identities and conflicts of identity, how does that feel bringing back English music now in this context? For you as a programmer and a performer, how do you go about creating programs and narratives that are relevant for today?
Well, I think I have to look at English music as part of a nexus of musical relationships that were going on in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and avoid programming it as purely, this is a program of English music, which happens so often, and particularly in the amateur orchestral world, British orchestral classics, English orchestra, and I think that's very misguided. Though it does have a place because you can hear those influences between English composers, but I would like people to hear Parry, as we are doing in Worthing, in the context of other influences. You might well have heard César Franck's symphonic variations at the Queen's Hall or Crystal Palace, just a member of the audience in those concerts, and certainly Mozart was a huge influence as well. So it's good to hear the symphony alongside those things. I do think we have to be a little careful culturally in the way that we promote English music and Englishness. When I performed this symphony in Romania, it was specifically because they wanted to do a concert on St. George's Day, and the orchestra manager realised it was St. George's Day and said, could you provide a list of English symphonies? I didn't think in a moment that he would choose an obscure symphony by Hubert Parry, but it was very well received. But then it was on a programme with music by Schumann and Haydn and Liszt, and we also played a short overture by Parry's pupil, Hamish McCunn. It was Scottish, of course, and so it was just nice to see it within that. If they'd asked me to do an all Elgar programme, or Holst Somerset Rhapsody and Elgar Cello Concerto and Enigma Variations or something, I think I'd have felt quite uncomfortable about that.
So for somebody coming to the concert in Worthing, what's their experience going to be if they've never heard Parry's music before? Ooh, this looks interesting. Parry's symphony.
I think they'll feel that they have experienced something that, although they don't know it, somehow feels familiar. That they will have had a good, easy listen. It sounds terrible to say that, but it's something that I think audiences who come to classical concerts slightly uncertain about what the experience is going to be, what they're going to take away from it. Do they need to have some prior knowledge of the music or be experts to actually access this? I think they will have a very pleasant experience listening to this. They may not know Parry's music, as you've said, but they may realise that they know Jerusalem from hearing it at the Proms, and it's woven into the national fabric now. They may have heard I Was Glad when they watched the last coronation, and they'll think, this is something which sounds familiar. But it's a very easily accessible symphony, and I hope then that they would have a thirst to come back for more and go on that journey with us. I've programmed Parry's symphonic variations for the following season, and I fully intend to just keep going until somebody tells me to stop.
The concert is on Sunday the 7th of June.
3 p.m. at Worthing Assembly Hall, Sunday the 7th of June. Tickets from the Worthing Theatres and Museums box office.
Looking forward to it.